The notification sound from my banking app cut through the humid Singapore morning like a blade. I was sipping my usual green tea latte on the 42nd floor of Marina Bay Financial Center, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and amber, when my phone buzzed with an alert that would shatter my carefully constructed world abroad. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Property sale completed. Funds deposited, $847,000. Reference, 12 on 47 Maple Street, Portland, Oregon. My hands trembled as I read the message again. Then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The Victorian house on Maple Street wasn't just any property. It was my inheritance. My father's final gift to me. The home where I'd spent my childhood, where he'd taught me to change car oil in the driveway, and where we'd planted the oak tree that now towered over the front yard. The house that had been legally mine for the past 2 years, ever since cancer had claimed him at 54. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee shop around me continued its morning rhythm. Business, professionals rushing past with briefcases and laptops, their conversations a blend of English, Mandarin, and Tamil that had become the soundtrack of my 18 months in Singapore. But I felt utterly alone, disconnected from the bustling energy that usually energized me for another day of building the fintech startup that had brought me halfway around the world. My name is Jordan Taylor, and I'd been running from grief. When I accepted the position as head of digital strategy for a promising payment platform company in Southeast Asia. At 28, I thought I had everything figured out. A thriving career in financial technology, a salary that let me live comfortably in one of the world's most expensive cities, and enough distance from Portland to avoid dealing with the complicated family dynamics that had emerged after Dad's death. When David Taylor passed away, he left behind more than just memories and a house. He left behind my mother, Linda, who had remarried Robert Hayes just 6 months after the funeral. The speed of their union had shocked everyone who knew. Our family, especially considering Robert had been Dad's business acquaintance rather than a close friend. Robert owned Hayes Properties, a mid-sized real estate agency downtown, and had apparently provided comfort to my grieving mother during those dark months following Dad's death. I'd tried to be supportive of Mom's decision to remarry, understanding that grief affects everyone differently. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Robert would insert himself into every aspect of our family's financial affairs. Within weeks of their wedding, he was asking pointed questions about Dad's estate, suggesting that keeping the Maple Street house was financially imprudent, and hinting that my mother deserved access to the equity trapped in what he called an underutilized asset. The house itself was a charming 3-bedroom Victorian built in 1924, complete with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a detached garage that Dad had converted into his woodworking shop. More importantly, the property included a small duplex on the adjacent lot that had been generating rental income for the past decade. Dad had purchased both properties as a long-term investment, always saying they would provide security for my future. His will had been crystal clear. Upon his death, the properties would transfer directly to me, with the understanding that the rental income would help establish my financial independence. Mom would inherit the life insurance proceeds and his retirement accounts, while I would receive the real estate holdings that represented his life's work in building generational wealth. The legal transfer had been handled by Patricia Klein, a family attorney who had known Dad since college and had witnessed firsthand his careful planning for my future. The paperwork was ironclad, filed properly with the county, and had never been contested. Until now, apparently. Sitting in that Singapore coffee shop, staring at the banking notification that indicated someone had sold my property without my knowledge or consent, I felt a familiar fire ignite in my chest. It was the same determination that had driven me to excel in computer science at Portland State, the same fierce independence that had pushed me to negotiate my own job offer in Singapore rather than accepting the first proposal, the same refusal to be underestimated that had characterized my entire adult life. I immediately tried calling the number listed in the banking notification, reaching an automated system for Cascade Title Company. After navigating through multiple menu options, I finally reached a human being who confirmed my worst fears. The property at 1247 Maple Street had indeed been sold 3 days earlier to a private investor for $950,000, with proceeds deposited into an account belonging to Robert and Linda Hayes. The title agent seemed genuinely confused when I explained that I was the actual owner of the property. She pulled up the file and discovered that the sale had been processed using a power of attorney document that allegedly gave Robert Hayes the authority to act on my behalf in real estate transactions. When I demanded to see this document, she agreed to email me a copy immediately. What I received 20 minutes later was a forgery so obvious it would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so devastating. The supposed power of attorney bore my signature, but it was clearly traced from some other document. The notarization was dated while I was verifiably in Singapore, attending a conference that had been documented extensively on my company's social media accounts. Most damning of all, the document granted Robert authority over property that the paperwork incorrectly described, using an old address that hadn't been accurate since the city had renumbered the street 15 years earlier. My hands were shaking, with rage as I immediately called my mother's phone. It went straight to voicemail. I tried the house phone, the number I'd been calling since childhood, and heard Robert's voice on the answering machine for the first time. His tone was casual, almost cheerful, as he invited callers to leave a message and promised to return calls promptly. I left a message that I hoped conveyed my fury without crossing into territory that could be used against me later. Then I hung up and stared at my reflection in the coffee shop window, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My stepfather had stolen my inheritance, forged legal documents, and apparently convinced my mother to participate in what amounted to fraud. The next few hours passed in a blur of international phone calls and desperate internet searches. I contacted the Multnomah County Recorder's Office, Portland Police Department, and even the Oregon State Bar's ethics hotline. Each conversation revealed new layers of the problem, but no immediate solutions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The property had been sold to a legitimate buyer who had no knowledge of the fraud. The sale proceeds had already been distributed, and most frustrating of all, pursuing criminal charges would require my physical presence in Oregon to file reports and provide testimony. Marcus Chen, my best friend since our undergraduate computer science program, picked up his phone on the second ring despite the 15-hour time difference. Marcus had stayed in Portland after graduation, building a successful software development consultancy while I'd chased opportunities around the world. His calm, analytical approach to problems had gotten me through countless crises over the years, from failed relationships to career decisions. "Jordan, you sound terrible," he said after I explained the situation. "I'm looking at the property records online right now. This is insane. Robert actually filed documents claiming you gave him power of attorney to sell your father's house." "It gets worse," I told him, forwarding the forged paperwork to his email. "Look at this signature. It's not even close to how I actually sign legal documents. And the notarization happened while I was giving a presentation at the Singapore fintech summit. I have video evidence of where I was that day." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, and I could hear him typing rapidly. "Okay, this is definitely criminal fraud, but here's what worries me. Robert's been telling people around town that you asked him to handle the sale because you were too busy with your career to deal with Portland real estate. He's been setting up this narrative for months, Jordan. My neighbor works at the title company, and she mentioned last month that Robert Hayes was handling a sale for his stepdaughter who works overseas. The calculated nature of Robert's deception hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of weakness. He had been planning this theft for months, possibly since the day he married my mother. He had studied my schedule, researched my living situation in Singapore, and crafted a story that would make his fraud seem legitimate to the local professionals who would process the transaction. "What about Mom?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Is she part of this? Or is she another victim?" Marcus hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. "Jordan, your mother signed papers too. The title company has her signature on documents, acknowledging the sale and authorizing the deposit of proceeds into their joint account. I don't know if Robert manipulated her or if she was a willing participant, but legally, she's involved." The betrayal cut deeper than I had expected. I could almost understand Robert's motivation. He had married into a family with significant assets and saw an opportunity to access wealth that wasn't legally his. But my mother had been Dad's partner for 23 years. She had sat beside me at his bedside during those final weeks, holding my hand as he explained why the house meant so much to him and why he wanted me to have it. She knew the property represented more than just financial security. It was his way of ensuring I would always have roots in Portland, always have a connection to the life we had built together. The afternoon Singapore sun was brutal as I walked back to my apartment, my mind racing through possible responses to Robert's theft. The most obvious solution was to fly back to Portland immediately and confront him directly. But I had learned enough about international law during my business career to know that acting impulsively could damage any legal case I might have. Instead, I needed professional help from someone who understood both American property law and the complexities of pursuing justice while living overseas. That evening, I spent hours researching attorneys who specialized in international legal disputes. The Singapore legal system was sophisticated and well connected to American courts, but I needed someone with specific experience in cross-border property fraud. Most of the lawyers I contacted by email promised to respond within several business days, a timeline that felt completely inadequate given the urgency of my situation. It was nearly midnight when I found Rachel Morgan's website. Her firm, Morgan International Legal Services, specialized in exactly the kind of complex situation I was facing. Her biography indicated 15 years of experience in international property disputes, with particular expertise in cases involving American citizens living abroad. More importantly, her office hours indicated she was available for emergency consultations 24 hours a day. Rachel answered her phone on the third ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the late hour in Singapore and early morning in her Portland office. "Ms. Taylor, I've been expecting your call," she said, which caught me completely off guard. Expecting my call? How is that possible? Word travels fast in Portland's legal community when someone forges documents to steal a prominent family's property, Rachel explained. "Patricia Klein contacted me yesterday. She's the attorney who handled your father's estate, and she's been monitoring the situation since Robert Hayes started making inquiries about your property 6 months ago. She suspected he might attempt something like this, and wanted to ensure you had immediate access to specialized legal representation." The relief I felt was overwhelming. Patricia Klein had been Dad's friend for decades, and her foresight in anticipating Robert's fraud meant I wasn't facing this crisis alone. Rachel Morgan's calm confidence suggested she had dealt with similar situations and knew exactly how to proceed. What Patricia didn't anticipate was the sophistication of Robert's approach, Rachel continued. He's been building a paper trail for months, creating a narrative that portrays you as an absentee property owner who was eager to liquidate assets for your international lifestyle. He's been very careful to make the fraud look legitimate to anyone who doesn't examine the documents closely. "But the power of attorney is obviously forged," I protested. "The signature doesn't match, the notarization is impossible, and the property description is wrong." "All true," Rachel agreed. But Robert has been showing people selected portions of the paperwork, not the complete documents. He's been telling a consistent story about your supposed authorization, and he's chosen his witnesses carefully. We're going to need to be equally strategic in our response. Rachel outlined a preliminary plan that was both comprehensive and aggressive. First, we would file an emergency injunction to freeze the sale proceeds before Robert could transfer them offshore or make them difficult to recover. Second, we would document my whereabouts during the supposed signing of the power of attorney, creating an unshakable alibi that would expose the forgery. Third, we would contact the buyer of my property to inform them of the fraud and explore options for unwinding the sale. Most importantly, Rachel explained that my physical presence in Oregon wouldn't be required for the initial legal filings. Her firm had experience working with international clients and could handle most of the preliminary work remotely, allowing me to maintain my position in Singapore while building a comprehensive case against Robert. "There's one more thing you should know," Rachel said as our conversation concluded. "Robert has been telling people that you've abandoned your American citizenship and have no intention of returning to Portland. He's trying to make your absence seem permanent and voluntary, which would support his claim that you wanted him to handle your property affairs." The calculated maliciousness of Robert's lies took my breath away. Not only had he stolen my inheritance, but he was systematically destroying my reputation in the community where I had grown up. He was painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family and her country in pursuit of foreign wealth. "We're going to prove him wrong on every count," I told Rachel with determination. "And when we're finished, Robert Hayes is going to wish he had never heard the name Taylor." That night, I lay awake in my Singapore apartment, watching the city lights twinkle beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows, and planned my counterattack. Robert had underestimated me completely. He saw a young woman living far from home and assumed I would be too isolated and overwhelmed to mount an effective response to his theft. What he didn't understand was that my international experience had taught me patience, strategic thinking, and the value of building powerful alliances. My father had raised me to fight for what was right, to never back down from bullies, and to use intelligence rather than emotion when facing serious challenges. Robert Hayes was about to discover that David Taylor's daughter was not someone who could be robbed with impunity. The war for my inheritance was about to begin, and I intended to win. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that transformed my sleek Singapore apartment into a war room. Rachel Morgan had worked through the night, and by 7 a.m., Singapore time, my email inbox contained a comprehensive legal strategy that took my breath away. She hadn't just prepared paperwork, she had orchestrated a multi-pronged attack that would dismantle Robert's fraud piece by piece. The first document was an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order that would freeze all assets connected to the fraudulent sale. Rachel had identified 3 separate bank accounts where the proceeds might have been deposited, including Robert's business account at Hayes Properties and a recently opened joint account that he shared with my mother. More impressively, she had traced the money flow and discovered that Robert had already transferred $200,000 to an investment account, suggesting he was moving quickly to make the stolen funds difficult to recover. Her second filing was even more devastating. Rachel had contacted the Singapore Fintech Summit organizers and obtained official documentation of my presence at the conference, including time-stamped photos, hotel registration records, and signed attendance sheets that proved conclusively that I was 8,000 miles away when the power of attorney was supposedly notarized. She had also requested surveillance footage from the Marina Bay Conference Center that would show me presenting during the exact hour when Robert claimed I was in a Portland notary's office. But it was Rachel's third strategy that revealed the depth of her experience with international fraud cases. She had filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Bar against the notary who had allegedly witnessed my signature, triggering an investigation that would expose the forged documents. She had also contacted the title insurance company that had backed the fraudulent sale, informing them that they were about to face a massive claim due to their failure to verify the authenticity of the transaction documents. The beauty of Robert's overconfidence is that he created so much documentation, Rachel explained during our morning video call. Every forged signature, every false statement, every fraudulent filing becomes evidence of his criminal intent. He thought volume would create legitimacy, but instead he's given us dozens of felony counts to pursue. While Rachel handled the legal warfare, I focused on gathering intelligence about Robert's activities in Portland. Marcus had spent the weekend asking discreet questions around town, and what he discovered painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond the theft of my property. Robert had been telling elaborate stories about my supposed financial troubles in Singapore, claiming that I was desperately in debt and had begged him to liquidate my American assets to pay off foreign creditors. He had been particularly effective, with older community members who remembered my father fondly but knew little about my actual career success. Robert had convinced several of Dad's former business associates that I was in serious legal trouble overseas and that selling the property was the only way to prevent it from being seized by international authorities. The lies were so specific and detailed that people who should have known better had begun repeating them as established fact. "It's actually brilliant in a twisted way," Marcus observed during one of our daily calls. "Robert has been creating witnesses who will testify that you wanted the property sold. He's not just covering up his fraud, he's building a defense that portrays him as a helpful stepfather who was trying to rescue you from a crisis of your own making." The more I learned about Robert's manipulation tactics, the more I understood why my mother had participated in the scheme. Linda Taylor Hayes wasn't just a victim of financial fraud. She was a victim of psychological manipulation by someone who had studied her vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. Robert had convinced her that I was hiding financial troubles from her, that my prideful nature prevented me from asking for help, and that selling the property was an act of maternal protection rather than theft. Marcus had managed to speak with Tommy Hayes, Robert's son from his first marriage, who had become an unexpected source of information. Tommy was 25, worked as a graphic designer, and had never been close to his father. What he told Marcus was chilling in its implications. "Tommy says Robert has been planning this for over a year," Marcus reported. "Apparently, Robert researched your father's estate extensively before he even started dating your mother. He knew about the property values, the rental income, everything. Tommy thinks his father specifically targeted your mother because of her potential access to your inheritance. The revelation that Robert's entire relationship with my mother might have been a calculated scheme to access Dad's estate was almost too much to process. I had always assumed their quick marriage was about companionship and mutual support during a difficult time. The possibility that Robert had courted a grieving widow specifically to steal her daughter's inheritance added a layer of cruelty that made my determination to destroy him burn even brighter. Rachel's legal strategy began producing results within 48 hours. The emergency motion to freeze assets was granted by Judge Harrison, who had apparently been briefed by Patricia Klein about the suspicious nature of the property sale. Robert's bank accounts were immediately locked, preventing him from transferring any more of the stolen money beyond the reach of American courts. The reaction from Robert was swift and predictable. Within hours of learning about the asset freeze, he called my Singapore phone number, his voice alternating between fake concern and barely controlled rage. "Jordan, sweetheart, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he began, his tone sickeningly patronizing. "I've been trying to help you with your financial situation, and now some lawyer is telling lies about me to a judge. We need to talk about this like family." I had been expecting this call and had prepared for it carefully. Rachel had coached me on exactly how to respond, emphasizing the importance of getting Robert to make admissions that could be used as evidence later. "Help me with what financial situation, Robert?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and curious. "I'm not having any financial problems. In fact, my career has been incredibly successful." "Come now," Robert said, his voice taking on the tone he might use with a confused child. "Your mother and I know you've been struggling with debt in Singapore. You asked me to handle the sale of that old house because you needed the money quickly. I have the paperwork right here showing you gave me power of attorney to act on your behalf. I never gave you power of attorney, Robert. I never asked you to sell my father's house. And I certainly never authorized you to deposit the proceeds into your bank account. The silence on Robert's end of the call stretched for several seconds. Before he responded, and when he did, his mask of concerned stepfather slipped completely. "Listen to me very carefully, Jordan," he said, his voice cold and threatening. "You've been gone for over a year, living your fancy lifestyle overseas while your mother worried herself sick about you. That property was sitting empty, costing money in taxes and maintenance, generating rental income that you never even bothered to collect. I did what needed to be done to protect this family's interests. Protect this family's interests by stealing my inheritance? I didn't steal anything, Robert snapped. I managed assets that were being neglected by an absentee owner who couldn't be bothered to return home even for her stepfather's wedding anniversary. You want to play hardball with lawyers and judges? Fine. But remember that your mother is on my side in this, and she's the one who will suffer if you destroy this family over money." The call ended abruptly, but not before I had recorded every word of Robert's admissions and threats. His acknowledgement that he had sold the property without my explicit recent consent, combined with his attempt to justify the theft through emotional manipulation, would be devastating evidence in any criminal or civil proceeding. Rachel was delighted with the recording when I forwarded it to her later that day. "Robert just confessed to multiple felonies while trying to intimidate a witness," she observed with professional satisfaction. "He's either incredibly stupid or completely desperate, probably both." The legal momentum was building rapidly, but Rachel warned me that Robert wouldn't surrender without a fight. His next move was predictably vindictive and aimed at the person he knew I cared about most. My mother called me the following evening, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "Jordan, honey, I'm so sorry," she managed between gasps. "Robert showed me papers that said you were in terrible trouble, that you owed money to dangerous people in Asia, that selling the house was the only way to help you. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was doing what your father would have wanted me to do." Hearing my mother's anguish was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to remain focused on gathering information rather than providing comfort. Robert had clearly coached her on what to say, and I needed to understand the full scope of his manipulation. "What papers, Mom? What exactly did Robert show you?" "Bank statements that showed you were overdrawn, legal documents about debts, letters from lawyers in Singapore saying you were going to be arrested if you didn't pay what you owed. He said you were too proud to ask for help directly, so you had asked him to handle everything quietly." The sophistication of Robert's deception was breathtaking. He had created an entire fictional narrative about my life in Singapore, complete with forged financial documents and fake legal correspondence. He had presented my mother with evidence of a crisis that didn't exist, then positioned himself as the hero who was secretly solving problems to protect both of us. "Mom, none of that was true," I said gently. "I'm not in debt. I'm not in legal trouble. I never asked Robert to sell Dad's house. Everything he showed you was fake." The silence on my mother's end of the call was heartbreaking. I could imagine her sitting in the house where she had once been happy with my father, realizing that her new husband had manipulated her into betraying her only child. "But the money," she whispered. "We already spent some of the money. Robert said we needed to pay off the mortgage on this house, that it would be better for our financial security. Jordan, what are we going to do?" This was the moment I had been dreading. My mother wasn't just a victim of Robert's psychological manipulation. She was also legally complicit in his fraud. Her signature was on documents authorizing the deposit of stolen money into their joint account. She had benefited financially from the sale of my property, even if she had been tricked into participating. "We're going to fix this, Mom," I promised. though I wasn't entirely sure how. I have lawyers working on getting the property back and recovering the money. But you need to understand that Robert committed serious crimes, and there are going to be consequences. He says you're trying to send him to prison out of spite, my mother said, her voice small and frightened. He says you've always resented him for marrying me so quickly after your father died, and that this is your way of getting revenge. Robert's ability to twist every situation to his advantage was truly impressive in its awfulness. Even after being caught in massive fraud, he was managing to portray himself as the victim of my supposed vindictiveness. He was using my mother's love for me as a weapon against both of us, making her feel responsible for protecting him from the consequences of his own criminal actions. Mom, I need you to think carefully about something, I said, choosing my words with extreme care. If Dad were alive today and discovered that someone had forged my signature to steal the house he left me, what would he want you to do? The question hung in the air between us for a long moment before my mother answered in a voice I barely recognized. He would want me to make sure you got justice, she whispered, even if it meant I had to face the consequences of my mistakes. That conversation with my mother marked a turning point in the case, but not in the way I had expected. Within hours of our call, Robert had filed his own legal motion, accusing me of elder abuse and claiming that I was using international lawyers to intimidate and financially manipulate my elderly mother. His filing portrayed me as a greedy expatriate who was willing to destroy her own family for money, while painting himself as a protective husband, defending his wife from her ungrateful daughter's attacks. The audacity of Robert's counterattack was stunning, but Rachel seemed almost pleased by his aggressive response. He's overplaying his hand, she explained during our morning briefing. Every false accusation he makes creates another opportunity for us to expose his lies with documented evidence. He's turning this from a property dispute into a comprehensive pattern of fraud and harassment. Rachel's confidence proved justified when Judge Harrison reviewed Robert's filing and immediately ordered him to appear for a hearing on his accusations. The judge had apparently been disturbed by Robert's attempt to weaponize the legal system against his own stepdaughter and wanted to examine his claims in detail. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, which gave me time to make a decision I had been avoiding. Despite Rachel's assurance that my physical presence wasn't required for most of the legal proceedings, I knew that facing Robert directly would send a powerful message about my commitment to recovering my stolen inheritance. More importantly, my mother needed to see that I was willing to return home to fight for what was right, even if it meant confronting the man who had manipulated her so skillfully. I requested emergency leave from my position in Singapore, explaining to my understanding employer that I was dealing with a family crisis that required my immediate attention in the United States. My boss, who had been impressed with my work on several high-profile projects, agreed to hold my position for up to 6 weeks while I resolved what he diplomatically called urgent personal matters. The flight from Singapore to Portland took over 20 hours, giving me plenty of time to mentally prepare for what awaited me at home. I spent much of the journey reviewing the evidence Rachel had compiled, studying Robert's financial records that had been revealed during the asset freeze, and planning my strategy for the upcoming confrontation. What I discovered in those financial documents was even more damaging than I had expected. Robert hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had been systematically draining my mother's resources for months. The mortgage payoff he had described to her had never happened. Instead, he had used the money from my property sale to pay off his own business debts, invest in risky stock trades, and finance a lifestyle that was completely beyond his legitimate means as a small-town real estate agent. The man who had positioned himself as my mother's financial protector had actually been preparing to leave her bankrupt and alone while he disappeared with the proceeds of his elaborate fraud. The only reason he hadn't already vanished was that my legal intervention had frozen his access to the stolen money before he could complete his escape plan. Landing at Portland International Airport felt surreal after 18 months in Singapore. The Pacific Northwest's gray October sky and drizzling rain were a stark contrast to the tropical climate I had grown accustomed to, but something about the familiar environment filled me with renewed determination. This was my home. These were my people, and Robert Hayes was about to discover that stealing from a tailor came with consequences he had never imagined. Marcus met me at baggage claim, his familiar grin providing the first moment of genuine happiness I had felt since discovering Robert's theft. We had maintained our friendship across continents and time zones, but seeing him in person reminded me of the strength that came from having people who knew me well and supported me unconditionally. "Welcome home, Jordan," he said, embracing me tightly. "Ready to destroy your stepfather's entire world?" I smiled for the first time in days, feeling the pieces of my counterattack finally falling into place. "Let's go get my inheritance back." The drive through Portland's familiar streets felt like traveling backward through time. Marcus navigated the late afternoon traffic while I stared out at neighborhoods I had explored as a child, coffee shops where I had studied during college, and the bridge where Dad had taught me to drive when I was 16. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, yet somehow more significant now that I understood what I was fighting to preserve. Rachel had arranged for us to meet at her downtown office before the courthouse hearing, and as Marcus pulled into the parking garage beneath the steel and glass tower that housed Morgan International Legal Services, I felt a surge of nervous energy that reminded me of preparing for final exams or job interviews. The difference was that this time, the stakes weren't just personal success or failure. This was about justice, family, and the legacy my father had worked his entire life to build. Rachel Morgan in person was even more impressive than she had seemed during our video calls. Tall and elegant, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, she radiated the kind of quiet confidence that comes from winning cases that others consider unwinnable. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her office was a masterpiece of organized efficiency that immediately put me at ease. "Jordan, I'm so glad you decided to return for this hearing," she said, gesturing for Marcus and me to take seats at a polished conference table. "Judge Harrison specifically requested your presence after reviewing Robert's accusations. He wants to hear directly from you about your relationship with your stepfather and your knowledge of the property transaction." The conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the Columbia River and Mount Hood. But Rachel had positioned us so that the documents spread across the table commanded our attention. The evidence she had assembled was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. Bank records, phone logs, email correspondences, property filings, and witness statements created a comprehensive timeline of Robert's fraud that began months before he had even married my mother. "What we've discovered goes far beyond simple property theft," Rachel explained, opening a thick folder labeled Hayes Criminal Enterprise. "Robert has been running what amounts to a sophisticated confidence scheme targeting widowed women with substantial assets. Your mother wasn't his first victim, and if we hadn't intervened, she wouldn't have been his last." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had assumed Robert's targeting of my mother was opportunistic, a matter of being in the right place, at the right time to exploit a grieving woman's vulnerability. The possibility that he was a serial predator who systematically identified and manipulated wealthy widows added a layer of premeditation that made his crimes exponentially more serious. Rachel spread out a series of photographs and documents. That told a chilling story. Over the past 5 years, Robert had developed relationships with at least 3 other recently widowed women in the Portland metropolitan area. In each case, he had followed a similar pattern, establishing himself as a trusted friend during their grief, gradually inserting himself into their financial affairs, and ultimately gaining access to assets that he diverted for his own use. Margaret Chen lost her husband's life insurance proceeds, Rachel explained, pointing to a photograph of an elderly Asian woman. Robert convinced her to invest the money in a real estate development project that existed only on paper. When she realized she had been defrauded, Robert disappeared from her life completely. The second victim was Patricia Williams, a retired teacher whose husband had left her their family home and a substantial pension. Robert had convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage on the property, promising to invest the proceeds in high-yield bonds that would provide her with additional income. Instead, he had used the money to finance his lifestyle while Patricia struggled to make payments on a loan that was consuming her home equity. The third victim was especially tragic, Rachel continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. Dorothy Martinez was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months after her husband died. Robert became her financial power of attorney and systematically emptied her accounts before her children realized what was happening. By the time they obtained legal guardianship, he had stolen over $300,000. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Robert Hayes wasn't just a con artist. He was a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable women during the most difficult periods of their lives. He studied their grief, identified their weaknesses, and exploited their trust to gain access to wealth they had accumulated over decades of hard work and careful saving. "How did you discover all this?" I asked, struggling to process the magnitude of Robert's criminal enterprise. "Patricia Klein deserves the credit," Rachel replied. She noticed patterns in the legal documents Robert was filing and started asking questions around the legal community. Several attorneys mentioned unusual transactions involving recently widowed clients, and when Patricia started connecting the dots, she realized Robert was working from a playbook. Marcus leaned forward, studying the photographs of Robert's victims. "Does my mother know about these other women?" I asked. "Not yet," Rachel replied. "We wanted to present the evidence to the judge first, establish the pattern of criminal behavior, and then decide how best to inform Linda about the true nature of the man she married. This information will be devastating for her, but it's also the key to demonstrating that she was manipulated rather than willingly participating in fraud." The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, giving us the evening to review testimony and prepare for what Rachel warned would be an aggressive defense from Robert's attorney. She had learned that Robert had hired Jonathan Pierce, a criminal defense lawyer known for his willingness to attack victims and witnesses in pursuit of creating reasonable doubt about his client's guilt. "Pierce will try to portray you as a spoiled expatriate who abandoned her family and is now using expensive lawyers to punish her stepfather for providing stability to her grieving mother," Rachel explained. "He'll argue that the property sale was authorized, that you're manufacturing this crisis for attention, and that your real motivation is resentment about your mother's remarriage." The strategy wasn't particularly original, but Rachel acknowledged that it could be effective if Robert presented himself well and I appeared defensive or emotional on the witness stand. The key to destroying his narrative would be methodical presentation of evidence that exposed every lie he had told and every document he had forged. That evening, Marcus and I drove to the house on Maple Street where I had grown up, now occupied by strangers who had unknowingly purchased stolen property. The new owners had painted the exterior a cheerful yellow and had planted flowers in the beds where my father had grown vegetables. It looked happy and loved, which somehow made seeing it more painful than if it had been neglected. "We're going to get it back," Marcus said quietly, understanding without words what I was feeling. "Rachel's case is rock solid. There's no way Robert can explain away the evidence." "It's not just about the house," I replied, watching lights come on in the windows where I had once felt completely safe and loved. "It's about what he did to Mom, what he did to those other women, what he represents. He's a parasite who feeds on people's grief, and he needs to be stopped before he destroys anyone else's life." The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather that matched my mood as we walked up the steps of the Multnomah County Courthouse. The building was the imposing structure of stone and glass that had been designed to convey the weight and dignity of the legal system. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the quiet energy of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and family members navigating the complex machinery of justice. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I had expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly harsh appearance. Judge Harrison was already at the bench when we entered, a distinguished man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up as we took our seats at the plaintiff's table, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Robert entered the courtroom 5 minutes later, accompanied by Jonathan Pierce, and looking every inch the respectable businessman in a navy suit and conservative tie. He had lost weight since I had last seen him, and there were new lines around his eyes that suggested he was feeling the pressure of the legal proceedings. When his gaze met mine across the courtroom, his expression showed no trace of the fake concern he had displayed during our phone conversation. Instead, I saw cold calculation and barely controlled hostility. My mother entered the courtroom just before the hearing began, moving slowly and looking fragile in a way that broke my heart. She was dressed in black, as if attending a funeral, and her face showed the strain of the past weeks. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, but she made no move to approach. Robert had positioned himself between us, literally and figuratively, and she seemed afraid to acknowledge me directly. This hearing will address the emergency motion filed by Robert Hayes challenging the asset freeze ordered by this court. Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the small courtroom. Mr. Hayes claims that the freeze was based on false accusations made by his stepdaughter, Jordan Taylor, and that he acted within his legal authority when he sold property at 1247 Maple Street. Jonathan Pierce rose to address the court, his manner confident and slightly indignant. Your Honor, my client is the victim of a vindictive attack by a stepdaughter who has abandoned her family responsibilities and is now using international lawyers to harass a man who has done nothing but try to help his wife and stepdaughter during a difficult time. Pierce's opening statement was exactly what Rachel had predicted, painting me as the aggressor and Robert as the victim. He argued that I had given Robert power of attorney to handle my affairs while I pursued my career overseas, that the property sale was legitimate and authorized, and that my legal challenge was motivated by resentment and greed, rather than any actual wrongdoing. Ms. Taylor has been living in Singapore for over 18 months, Your Honor, making no effort to maintain her Portland property or collect the rental income it was generating. When her stepfather, acting out of genuine concern for the family's financial well-being, took steps to liquidate an asset that was being neglected, she responded with accusations of fraud and theft. Pierce's performance was polished and persuasive, but I noticed that he was careful to avoid specific details about the power of attorney document or the circumstances of the property sale. His strategy seemed to be creating an emotional narrative that would distract from the evidence rather than addressing the legal facts of the case. Rachel's response was methodical and devastating. She began by presenting the forged power of attorney document on a large screen, highlighting the obvious discrepancies in signature, the impossible notarization date, and the incorrect property description. She then displayed time-stamped photographs of me presenting at the Singapore Fintech Summit during the exact hour when I was supposedly signing legal documents in Portland. Your Honor, the defendant didn't just make a mistake or misunderstand his authority, Rachel stated calmly. He created fraudulent documents, forged signatures, and built an elaborate deception designed to steal property that legally belonged to his stepdaughter. This wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was a calculated crime. The evidence Rachel presented was overwhelming in its precision and scope. She showed bank records proving that Robert had deposited the sale proceeds into accounts I had never authorized him to access. She presented testimony from the notary who had allegedly witnessed my signature, confirming that she had never met me and had no record of notarizing any documents in my name. She displayed email correspondence between Robert and the title company, where he had made false statements about my supposed financial troubles and urgent need to liquidate assets. Most damaging of all, Rachel played the recorded phone conversation where Robert had admitted to selling the property without my explicit consent while attempting to justify his actions through emotional manipulation and threats. Judge Harrison listened to the evidence with increasing concern, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested he was developing a clear understanding of Robert's deception. When Pierce attempted to object to certain pieces of evidence, the judge overruled him with terse explanations about the relevance of the material to the fraud allegations. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Harrison said after Rachel had presented her evidence, "your client claimed that Ms. Taylor authorized the sale of her property. How do you explain the forged power of attorney document?" Pierce looked genuinely uncomfortable, for the first time during the hearing. "Your Honor, there may have been errors in the documentation, but my client's intent was legitimate. He was acting in what he believed to be his stepdaughter's best interests. Acting in her best interests by forging her signature and lying to a title company about her whereabouts and financial situation." The judge's question hung in the air without a satisfactory answer from Pierce, who seemed to realize that his client's position was becoming untenable. Robert, sitting at the defense table, had gone pale and was whispering urgently to his attorney. "Your Honor," Pierce said, clearly improvising now, "my client requests permission to address the court directly. He wants to explain his actions and his genuine concern for his family's welfare. It was a desperate move that Rachel had warned me might happen. When criminal defendants realize their legal arguments are failing, they sometimes attempt to appeal directly to the judge's emotions with personal testimony. Unfortunately for Robert, Rachel had prepared for this possibility." Judge Harrison granted Robert permission to speak, and he rose slowly, his composure noticeably shaken by the evidence that had been presented. When he began talking, his voice carried the same patronizing tone he had used during our phone conversation, as if he were patiently explaining a complex situation to people who simply didn't understand. "Your Honor, I married Linda Taylor Hayes because I loved her and wanted to provide stability during the most difficult period of her life," Robert began. Her daughter Jordan had moved to Singapore and was struggling with financial problems. She was too proud to discuss with her family. The property was sitting empty, costing money in taxes and maintenance, and Jordan had asked me privately to handle its sale so she could pay off debts without embarrassing herself in front of her mother. The lies flowed smoothly from Robert's mouth, delivered with apparent sincerity, and supported by just enough half-truths to sound plausible. He painted himself as a devoted husband and concerned stepfather who had been trying to protect both the women he loved from financial disaster and family embarrassment. "I may have made errors in the paperwork, Your Honor, but my motives were pure. I was trying to help a young woman who was too proud to ask for assistance and too far away to handle her affairs properly. Now she's returned with expensive lawyers and accusations of fraud, apparently because she's decided she doesn't want to face the consequences of her financial decisions." Robert's performance was impressive in its calculated manipulation, but he had made a critical error. By testifying under oath about his motivations and actions, he had opened himself up to cross-examination by Rachel, who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Mr. Hayes," Rachel began, rising from her seat with predatory grace, "you testified that Jordan asked you privately to handle the sale of her property. When did this conversation take place?" Robert hesitated, apparently realizing he had walked into a trap. "It was several months ago during one of our phone conversations." "Can you provide phone records showing this conversation took place?" "I don't keep detailed records of family phone calls." "But you do keep detailed records of your business calls, don't you? In fact, during the asset freeze investigation, we obtained your complete phone records for the past year. Those records show no international calls to Jordan's Singapore number until the day after the property sale was completed. How do you explain that?" The color drained from Robert's face as he realized the implications of Rachel's question. He had just testified under oath about conversations that the phone records proved had never taken place. "I may have spoken with her through her mother or through email," Robert stammered, his composure finally cracking. "We've also obtained your email records, Mr. Hayes. There are no messages between you and Jordan discussing the property sale or any financial difficulties. In fact, there are no emails between you and Jordan at all until she contacted you to demand an explanation for the unauthorized sale of her inheritance. Rachel continued her methodical destruction of Robert's testimony, forcing him to contradict himself repeatedly as she exposed lie after lie. She presented evidence of his previous fraudulent activities with other widowed women, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior that made his claims of good intentions laughable. The most devastating moment came when Rachel asked Robert to explain why he had transferred $200,000 of the sale proceeds to a personal investment account within hours of the transaction closing, money that he had used to pay off business debts and finance personal expenses rather than protecting it for my supposed benefit. If you were genuinely trying to help Jordan with her financial problems, why didn't you contact her immediately after the sale to let her know the money was available? Why did you spend weeks transferring funds and making investments before she discovered the sale through her banking alerts? Judge Harrison responded to Robert's outburst with swift authority. Mr. Hayes, any further contact with Ms. Taylor or attempts to intimidate witnesses will result in additional criminal charges. I suggest you focus your energy on preparing for your criminal trial rather than making threats you are in no position to carry out. The court officers escorted Robert from the courtroom, and I watched him leave with a sense of finality that I hadn't expected to feel. This man who had inserted himself into my family and stolen my inheritance was now just another criminal facing the consequences of his actions. He no longer had any power over my life or my mother's future. Outside the courthouse, Rachel and I stood on the steps overlooking the city while Marcus went to bring the car around. The October rain had stopped, and pale sunlight was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. It felt symbolic somehow, as if the weather itself was acknowledging that the worst of the storm had passed. What happens next with the Deo property? I asked, still struggling to believe that my father's house would actually be returned to me. The court order requires the current owners to be notified immediately, Rachel explained. Because they purchased the property in good faith and without knowledge of the fraud, they'll be compensated from Robert's assets for their loss. The title will be transferred back to you within 30 days, along with all rental income that should have been collected during Robert's unauthorized management. The process would be complex, involving multiple legal proceedings and financial calculations, but Rachel was confident that my ownership of the property would be fully restored. More importantly, the rental income from the duplex would resume, flowing to me, providing the financial security my father had always intended the property to create. What about my mother? I asked, the question that had been weighing on me since the hearing began. How do we help her recover from this? Rachel's expression softened with understanding. Linda is going to need time to process what happened, and probably professional counseling to deal with the psychological trauma of being manipulated so extensively. Robert didn't just steal money from her, he stole her ability to trust her own judgment about people and relationships. The healing process would be long and difficult, but Rachel had experience helping fraud victims rebuild their lives after being targeted by predators. She had already contacted a therapist who specialized in working with older adults who had been financially abused, and she was prepared to help my mother navigate the complex emotions that came with realizing she had been systematically deceived by someone she loved. Marcus pulled up to the courthouse steps, and as we drove through downtown Portland toward my mother's house, I felt the weight of the past months finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. The legal battle was essentially over, my inheritance was secure, and Robert would face criminal consequences for his actions. But the work of rebuilding family relationships and restoring trust would take much longer. My mother's house looked smaller and shabbier than I remembered, and I realized that Robert had probably been neglecting maintenance while diverting money for his personal use. The lawn needed mowing, the gutters were clogged with leaves, and several of the window screens were torn. It was a stark reminder of how Robert's presence in our lives had been destructive rather than supportive. despite his claims of wanting to help. Linda opened the door before I could knock, her eyes red from crying, but her posture straighter than it had been in the courtroom. She looked at me for a long moment before stepping aside to let me enter, and I could see her struggling with shame, grief, and relief in equal measure. "I'm so sorry, Jordan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have known. I should have questioned what he was telling me about you, about the money, about everything. Your father would be so disappointed in me." I embraced my mother for the first time since Dad's funeral, feeling how frail she had become during the months of stress and manipulation. "Dad would be proud of you for helping expose Robert's crimes," I told her firmly. "You were a victim, Mom. What happened wasn't your fault." We sat in the living room where I had spent countless evenings as a child, surrounded by furniture and photographs that Robert had been preparing to claim as his own. My mother explained, haltingly, how Robert had gradually isolated her from friends and family members who might have questioned his financial decisions or noticed inconsistencies in his stories about my supposed troubles overseas. "He made me feel like I was protecting you by keeping your problems secret," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He said that if anyone knew about your debts and legal troubles, it would ruin your reputation and make it impossible for you to return home. I thought I was being a good mother by helping you quietly." The sophistication of Robert's psychological manipulation was truly breathtaking. He had turned my mother's love for me into a weapon against both of us, making her feel complicit in protecting secrets that didn't exist while isolating her from anyone who might have exposed his lies. "He showed me bank statements with your name on them," Linda continued. "Official-looking letters from lawyers in Singapore, bills from creditors, court documents that said you were going to be arrested if you didn't pay what you owed. Everything looked so real, so official. How was I supposed to know it was all fake?" Rachel had explained to me earlier that creating convincing forged documents was easier than most people realized, especially for someone with Robert's experience in real estate transactions. He would have had access to official letterheads, legal forms, and document templates through his business relationships, making it relatively simple to create fake evidence of problems that didn't exist. "The important thing is that it's over now," I told my mother. "Robert can't hurt you anymore, and we're going to make sure you get back every penny he stole from you." Over the following days, the scope of Robert's crimes continued to expand as investigators dug deeper into his financial records and personal history. The forensic audit ordered by Judge Harrison revealed that he had been operating fraudulent schemes for at least 7 years, targeting not just widows, but also elderly men living alone and immigrant families who were unfamiliar with American legal and financial systems. The district attorney's office filed formal charges against Robert that included 12 felony counts ranging from grand theft and fraud to elder abuse and racketeering. The prosecution team was led by Maria Santos, an experienced attorney who specialized in financial crimes and had a reputation for securing maximum sentences for predators who targeted vulnerable populations. Rachel arranged for me to meet with Maria Santos to discuss my role as a witness in the criminal case, and I was impressed by her thorough preparation and genuine outrage at Robert's actions. She had reviewed every piece of evidence from our civil case and had identified additional charges that could be filed based on Robert's testimony and admissions during the court hearing. "Robert Hayes represents the worst kind of criminal," Maria explained during our meeting. "He doesn't steal from people randomly or impulsively. He studies their vulnerabilities, builds relationships based on trust and affection, and then systematically destroys their lives for his own profit. These cases are particularly heinous because the victims suffer not just financial loss, but profound emotional trauma." The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, giving the prosecution team time to locate and interview additional victims while building an unshakable case. Rachel estimated that Robert would ultimately be charged with stealing over $2 million from at least 15 victims, making him one of the most prolific financial predators in Oregon's recent history. Meanwhile, the process of restoring, my property ownership was moving forward more smoothly than Rachel had initially expected. The innocent purchasers of my father's house were cooperative and understanding when the situation was explained to them, and they agreed to accept compensation from Robert's seized assets in exchange for a quick resolution that would minimize legal costs for everyone involved. The rental income from the duplex had been accumulating in an escrow account since Robert's arrest, and when combined with the funds recovered from his personal accounts, I would actually receive more money than I had lost due to his fraud. The interest and penalties he owed would ensure that I was fully compensated for the time and stress his crimes had caused. More importantly, the house itself would soon be mine again, allowing me to make decisions about its future based on my own needs and preferences rather than Robert's manipulative schemes. I could choose to move back to Portland permanently, continue renting it out while I remained in Singapore, or even sell it legitimately if I decided that was the best option for my financial future. My mother's recovery was proceeding more slowly but with encouraging progress. The therapist Rachel had recommended was helping her understand the psychological techniques Robert had used to control her thoughts and decisions, and she was beginning to see herself as a victim rather than a willing participant in his crimes. It's hard to accept that someone I loved and trusted could be so completely different from who I thought he was, she told me during one of our daily phone calls. But it's also liberating to understand that the problems I thought you were having were all lies he created to manipulate me. Linda was also reconnecting with friends and family members she had distanced herself from during her marriage to Robert. Many of them had been concerned about the speed of her remarriage and the changes in her behavior, but Robert had been skillful in creating reasons why their input was unwelcome or harmful to family harmony. Patricia Klein had been particularly supportive, helping my mother understand the legal aspects of her situation while providing the emotional support of someone who had known our family for decades. Patricia's early suspicions about Robert had been vindicated, but she took no satisfaction in being proven right about something that had caused so much pain. Your father always said that Jordan had inherited his instincts for detecting dishonest people, Patricia told my mother during one of their conversations. David would be proud of how she handled this situation, using intelligence and legal strategy rather than emotion to expose Robert's crimes. The validation meant more to me than I had expected. My father had taught me to think critically, question authority when necessary, and never accept injustice without fighting back. The skills he had given me as a child had ultimately been the tools I needed to protect his legacy and restore his intended gift to my future. As November arrived and the immediate crisis began to resolve into manageable legal proceedings, I faced a decision about my own future that I had been avoiding. My employer in Singapore had been extraordinarily patient about my extended leave, but I couldn't remain absent indefinitely. I needed to choose between returning to my international career or staying in Portland to rebuild my relationship with my mother and oversee the restoration of my inherited property. The choice was complicated by my growing realization that the distance I had put between myself and my family after Dad's death had been as much about avoiding grief as pursuing opportunity. Living in Singapore had allowed me to escape the daily reminders of his absence, but it had also prevented me from processing his death in a healthy way and from being present when my mother needed support during her own grieving process. If I had been more involved in my mother's life during the months following Dad's death, I might have noticed Robert's manipulative behavior earlier and prevented some of the damage he caused. While I couldn't blame myself for his crimes, I did recognize that my physical and emotional absence had created opportunities for him to isolate my mother from people who might have protected her. Rachel advised me to take as much time as I needed to make the decision, pointing out that the property income would provide financial flexibility, regardless of which career path I chose. The house and duplex were now generating enough rental income to support a comfortable lifestyle in Portland, while my savings from my Singapore position would provide additional security for whatever came next. The beautiful thing about having real financial independence, Rachel observed, is that it allows you to make choices based on what's truly important to you, rather than what's merely economically necessary. The insight resonated deeply with me because it reflected exactly what my father had intended when he structured his estate to provide me with long-term security. He had wanted me to have options, to be able to choose a life path based on my values and relationships, rather than just financial pressures. As I prepared to make my decision about the future, I received an unexpected phone call that would influence my choice in ways I hadn't anticipated. Tommy Hayes, Robert's son, contacted me to apologize for his father's actions and to share information that would be crucial for the ongoing criminal investigation. "I've been struggling with whether to come forward," Tommy told me during our conversation. I knew my father was involved in questionable business practices, but I never realized the extent of what he was doing to innocent people. After seeing the news coverage of his arrest, I felt like I had to speak up. Tommy revealed that he had worked part-time in his father's real estate office during college and had noticed irregularities in Robert's client files and financial records. There were cash transactions that weren't properly documented, client accounts that seemed to disappear from the system, and personal expenses that were being charged to business accounts without legitimate justification. I asked him about some of the things I was seeing, and he told me it was all standard business practice that I didn't understand yet, Tommy explained. He made me feel naive for questioning him, and he gradually stopped giving me access to the financial records. I realize now that he was hiding the evidence of his fraud from his own family. Tommy's testimony would be valuable for the prosecution because it established that Robert's criminal behavior extended beyond his targeting of widows to include systematic business fraud and tax evasion. The information he provided would help investigators identify additional victims and recover more stolen assets. Williams had explained to me, "Blaming her for being deceived would be like blaming someone for being injured by a drunk driver. The responsibility lies entirely with the person who chose to commit the crime." Linda had also benefited from connecting with other victims of Robert's fraud through a support group that Dr. Williams facilitated. Sharing experiences with Margaret, Patricia, Dorothy, and others who had been similarly manipulated helped her realize that she wasn't alone in her experience and that recovery was possible with time and appropriate support. "We call ourselves the Survivors Club," my mother had told me with a small smile during one of our weekly dinners. "It sounds dramatic, but that's what we are. We survived Robert Hayes, and we're helping each other build stronger, wiser lives." The legal aftermath of Robert's case had extended far beyond his criminal conviction and imprisonment. The civil litigation to recover stolen assets and compensate victims had involved complex negotiations with banks, insurance companies, and investment firms where Robert had hidden or laundered money. Rachel had worked tirelessly to ensure that every dollar possible was recovered and distributed fairly among the people he had defrauded. The process had revealed the true scope of Robert's criminal enterprise, which had ultimately involved over 30 victims and stolen assets exceeding $3 million. His methodical approach to fraud and his ability to maintain multiple deceptive relationships simultaneously had impressed even experienced investigators who had seen many similar cases. Robert Hayes was operating what amounted to a one-man, organized crime syndicate, Detective Lisa Park had explained during a community presentation about fraud prevention. His success depended on careful victim selection, sophisticated psychological manipulation, and systematic isolation of targets from people who might have protected them. The case had received significant media attention, partly because of the amount of money involved, but primarily because of the vulnerable population Robert had targeted. Several news organizations had written feature stories about the investigation and trial, focusing on the warning signs that might help others avoid similar victimization. I had been interviewed for several of these articles, sharing my perspective, as someone who had lived overseas while a family member was being defrauded. The experience had taught me about the particular vulnerabilities that geographic distance could create, as well as the importance of maintaining regular, meaningful contact with elderly relatives who might be targeted by predators. The hardest part of fighting this fraud from Singapore wasn't the legal complexity or the financial implications, I had told one reporter. It was the guilt I felt about not being present to protect my mother when she needed me most. Geographic. Distance can become emotional distance if we're not careful, and that creates opportunities for predators to exploit. The media coverage had led to speaking opportunities at conferences and community events focused on elder abuse prevention and financial fraud awareness. I discovered that I enjoyed public speaking and had a talent for explaining complex financial crimes in ways that ordinary people could understand and remember. These presentations had also connected me with other professionals working in fraud prevention and victim advocacy, creating a network of colleagues who shared resources and referred cases to each other. The field was smaller than I had realized, but it was growing rapidly as financial crimes became more sophisticated and widespread. One of the most rewarding aspects of my new career direction had been the opportunity to work directly with other fraud victims, helping them understand what had happened to them and navigate the process of recovery. Many people who are defrauded experience shame and self-blame that can be as damaging as the financial losses themselves. Being able to provide both technical expertise and emotional support during their most difficult moments felt like a calling rather than just a job. My first independent case had come through a referral from Dr. Williams, who had been contacted by the daughter of an elderly man who suspected her father was being defrauded by a caregiver. The situation was complex, involving forged checks, unauthorized credit card use, and emotional manipulation that had isolated the victim from his family. Working with local law enforcement and adult protective services, I had been able to document the theft, recover most of the stolen money, and ensure that the perpetrator faced criminal consequences. "You have a gift for this work," the man's daughter had told me after the case was resolved. "You understand both the technical details and the human impact in ways that most investigators don't." Dad felt heard and validated throughout the process, not just like another case number. The feedback had reinforced my conviction that I had found the right professional path, one that combined my analytical skills with my desire to help people who had been hurt by others' greed and cruelty. Each case was different, but they all involved the same fundamental elements of betrayed trust, financial exploitation, and the need for both justice and healing. Marcus had been incredibly supportive of my career transition, offering both professional advice and personal encouragement as I navigated the challenges of starting a new practice. His software development expertise had been invaluable in creating secure systems for managing sensitive client information and evidence, and his friendship had provided stability during a period of significant life changes. "I've watched you grow into someone I barely recognize from your corporate consulting days," he had observed during one of our regular coffee meetings. "You're more engaged, more passionate, more purposeful. This work suits you in ways that international finance never did." The observation was accurate, though I hadn't fully realized the extent of the change until Marcus pointed it out. Fighting. For my inheritance had awakened qualities and interests that had been dormant during my years focused primarily on career advancement and financial success. The work I was doing now felt meaningful in ways that corporate achievement had never approached. My relationship with my mother had also evolved significantly during the months since Robert's conviction. The crisis had forced us to communicate more honestly and frequently than we had since my father's death, and we had discovered that we enjoyed each other's company in ways that had been obscured by grief and geographic distance. "I feel like I'm getting to know you as an adult for the first time," Linda had told me during one of our regular weekend visits. "When you were growing up, you were always so focused on achieving the next goal that I sometimes forgot to appreciate who you were becoming as a person." We had established new traditions that honored my father's memory while creating space for our own relationship to grow. Every Sunday, we visited his grave together, sharing stories and memories that kept his presence alive in our lives. Afterward, we would have lunch at a restaurant he had enjoyed, then spend the afternoon working in the garden he had planted at the house on Maple Street. The garden had been neglected during Robert's occupation of the property, but the perennial plants my father had chosen were resilient enough to recover with proper care. Restoring the flower beds and vegetable garden had become a metaphor for the broader process of healing our family had undertaken after Robert's fraud was exposed. "Your father always said that gardens teach patience and faith," my mother had observed while we planted new roses to replace ones that Robert had allowed to die. "You have to believe that what you're planting today will grow into something beautiful, even when you can't see the results immediately." The wisdom applied to more than just gardening. Rebuilding trust, processing trauma, and creating new patterns of family connection all required the same patience and faith that successful gardening demanded. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating, but the results were worth the investment of time and energy. Patricia Klein had remained an important source of support and advice throughout my transition back to Portland and into my new career. As someone who had known our family for decades, she provided continuity and perspective that helped me understand how the crisis with Robert fit into the larger story of our lives. "Your father would be proud of how you handled this situation," Patricia had told me during a recent visit to her office. "Not just because you recovered your inheritance, but because you used the experience to help other people and to strengthen your relationship with your mother." Patricia had also been instrumental in connecting me with other attorneys who specialized in elder law and victim advocacy, expanding my professional network and providing opportunities for collaboration on complex cases. Her reputation in the AI's legal community had opened doors that might have remained closed to someone without established credentials in fraud investigation. The house on Maple Street had undergone significant renovations during the month since I had regained ownership. The new tenants I had selected were a young family who appreciated the property's historical character and took excellent care of both the house and the surrounding grounds. Their rent payments provided steady income while ensuring that the property my father had chosen so carefully would be maintained and enjoyed by people who valued what he had created. I had kept my father's woodworking shop in the detached garage exactly as he had left it, and I found myself spending time there whenever I needed to think through particularly challenging cases or personal decisions. The familiar smell of sawdust and wood stain, combined with the organized arrangement of tools he had accumulated over decades, created a sense of connection that helped me feel his continued presence in my life. "I think Dad would approve of what I'm doing," I had told my mother during one of our garden visits. "He always said that the most important thing was using whatever talents you had to help people who needed it." The sentiment reflected values that had guided both my parents throughout their lives and that continued to influence my own choices about how to spend my time and energy. The financial security provided by my inherited property had given me the freedom to pursue work that was meaningful rather than just profitable, exactly as my father had intended when he structured his estate to provide me with long-term independence. Robert's imprisonment had brought closure to the criminal aspects of his fraud, but the civil litigation to recover additional assets was ongoing. Rachel continued to pursue claims against financial institutions and business partners who had either facilitated his crimes or failed to detect obvious warning signs of fraudulent activity. "We're still finding hidden assets and discovering victims," Rachel had reported during our most recent quarterly meeting. Robert was more sophisticated and more prolific than even we initially realized. The final accounting of his crimes may not be complete for another year. The ongoing discoveries reinforced my decision to specialize in fraud investigation and victim advocacy. The field clearly needed more professionals who understood both the technical complexity of modern financial crimes and the human impact on the people who were targeted. Every case I worked on revealed new tactics that predators were using and new vulnerabilities that needed to be protected. My educational background in financial technology had proven invaluable for understanding how criminals were exploiting digital banking systems, online investment platforms, and cryptocurrency exchanges to hide stolen money and avoid detection. Traditional law enforcement agencies often lack the technical expertise to investigate these crimes effectively. creating opportunities for specialists like me to make significant contributions to justice. The certification program I had completed in forensic financial analysis had been challenging but rewarding, teaching me investigation techniques that complemented my existing analytical skills. The combination of formal training and practical experience gained from Robert's case had prepared me to handle complex fraud investigations independently while maintaining the professional standards expected in legal proceedings. My first year of independent practice had been busier than I had expected, with referrals coming from attorneys, law enforcement agencies, and adult protective services throughout the Pacific Northwest. Each case was unique, but patterns were emerging that helped me identify common vulnerabilities and develop more effective prevention strategies. "You found your calling," Dr. Williams had observed during a recent conversation about a case we were working on together. "The victims you help aren't just recovering financially, they're regaining their sense of agency and self-worth. That's healing that goes far beyond what the legal system can provide alone." The observation captured something essential about why the work felt so fulfilling. Financial fraud victims often suffered psychological damage that persisted long after their money was recovered or their cases were resolved in court. Being able to address both the practical and emotional aspects of their recovery created opportunities for more complete healing than either legal or therapeutic intervention could achieve independently. My relationship with Rachel had evolved from attorney-client to professional colleagues who collaborated regularly on complex cases. Her experience with international law and cross-border investigations complemented my technical expertise and victim advocacy skills, creating a partnership that was more effective than either of us could be working alone. "We make a good team," Rachel had said during a recent case strategy meeting. "Your ability to connect with victims and explain complex financial concepts in understandable terms is rare in this field. Most investigators are either technically competent or emotionally skilled, but not both." The collaboration had led to several successful prosecutions of sophisticated fraud schemes, including a cryptocurrency investment scam that had defrauded elderly investors across multiple states, and an online romance fraud operation that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from lonely widows and widowers. Each victory in court felt personal because I understood from my own experience how devastating financial fraud could be for victims and their families. The shame, confusion, and sense of betrayal that accompanied being defrauded were familiar. Emotions that I could address with genuine empathy rather than just professional sympathy. Tommy Hayes had remained in contact with me periodically, providing updates on his father's imprisonment and sharing information about additional victims who had been identified through ongoing investigations. His willingness to cooperate with law enforcement, despite the personal cost, had been crucial for several prosecutions, and his testimony had helped establish patterns of behavior that made Robert's crimes easier to understand and prosecute. "I still struggle with anger about what he did," Tommy had told me during a recent phone conversation. "Not just to your family, but to all those women who trusted him. I keep wondering if there were signs I should have recognized, things I could have done to stop him earlier." I had assured Tommy that he wasn't responsible for his father's crimes, and that his cooperation with investigators had probably prevented additional victims from being defrauded. Children of criminals often carried misplaced guilt about their parents' actions, but Tommy's willingness to testify against his father had demonstrated moral courage that deserved recognition rather than self-blame. The media attention surrounding Robert's case had subsided, but the educational impact had been lasting. Several community organizations had developed fraud prevention programs based on the tactics Robert had used, and law enforcement agencies had revised their training materials to include information about predators who specifically target grieving spouses. "Your case has become a teaching example in our academy," Detective Park had told me during a recent fraud prevention presentation. "It illustrates so many important concepts about victim selection, manipulation techniques, and the importance of swift legal response that it's become required study material for new investigators." The knowledge that Robert's crimes had contributed To better protection for other potential victims provided some sense that positive outcomes had emerged from our painful experience. The educational value of his case would continue to benefit people long after his imprisonment ended, creating a legacy of protection rather than just punishment. My mother had begun dating again, something I hadn't expected but had come to support, wholeheartedly. Her relationship with a retired teacher named Frank Morrison was developing slowly and carefully, with both of them understanding the importance of building trust gradually after their previous experiences with deception and loss. Frank knows about Robert and what happened, Linda had told me when she first mentioned their relationship. He's patient with my need to take things slowly, and he's never pressured me about money or made suggestions about how I should handle my affairs. The contrast with Robert's behavior was stark and reassuring. Frank seemed genuinely interested in my mother as a person, rather than as a source of financial opportunity, and he had made efforts to include me in their activities. Rather than isolating her from family relationships, he's the opposite of Robert in every way that matters, I had told Marcus during one of our regular catch-up conversations. Honest, transparent, respectful of Mom's independence, and genuinely caring about her well-being rather than what he can get from her. Watching my mother rebuild her capacity for trust and companionship had been inspiring and had reinforced my conviction that recovery from fraud was possible with appropriate support and sufficient time. The resilience she had demonstrated throughout the legal proceedings and her subsequent healing process had been remarkable and had strengthened our relationship in unexpected ways. The townhouse I had purchased for my residence and office had become a comfortable base for both my personal life and my growing practice. The location in Portland's Pearl District provided easy access to courts, law enforcement agencies, and professional services while offering the urban amenities I had enjoyed during my time in Singapore. The space had been designed to accommodate both confidential client meetings and the technical equipment needed for complex financial investigations. A secure document storage system, high-speed internet connections, and video conferencing capabilities allowed me to work effectively with clients, attorneys, and law enforcement agencies throughout the region. You've created something special. Here, Marcus had observed during a recent visit to my office. It feels professional but not intimidating, secure but welcoming. Clients probably feel comfortable sharing sensitive information in this environment. The observation was accurate and had been intentional. Many fraud victims were already feeling vulnerable and ashamed when they sought help, and I wanted them to feel safe and supported rather than judged or pressured. The office design reflected values of compassion and professionalism that guided my approach to client relationships. As spring turned toward summer, I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed since I first discovered Robert's theft of my inheritance. The journey from that shocking banking notification in Singapore to my current life as a fraud investigator in Portland had involved challenges I couldn't have imagined and had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The financial security provided by my father's carefully planned legacy had made my career transition possible, but the emotional fulfillment came from using my skills to help other people who had experienced similar violations of trust. Each case I worked on honored his memory by continuing his values of protecting people who needed assistance and standing up to those who would exploit others' vulnerabilities. You've become who you were meant to be, my mother had told me during a recent conversation. Your father always said you had the intelligence and determination to accomplish anything you wanted, but I think he would be especially proud that you chose to use those gifts to help people. The validation meant everything to me because it confirmed that the path I had chosen aligned with the values both my parents had tried to instill in me throughout my childhood and young adulthood. The financial success I had achieved in Singapore had been satisfying, but it had never provided the sense of purpose and connection that came from my current work. The legal system had provided justice in Robert's case, but the broader work of healing and prevention was ongoing and would require sustained effort from many people across multiple professions. I was grateful to have found my place in that, effort and to be contributing to solutions that would protect other families from experiencing what we had endured. Robert remained imprisoned and would face several more years behind bars before becoming eligible for parole. The restitution. Orders ensured that he would be paying compensation to his victims for the rest of his life, even after his release. More importantly, his criminal record would make it much more difficult for him to gain the trust and access he would need to commit similar crimes in the future. The house on Maple Street continued to generate rental income that supported my lifestyle and provided the financial foundation for my investigative practice. The property values in Portland had appreciated significantly, making my father's investment even more valuable than he had anticipated when he purchased the properties decades earlier. But the true value of his legacy wasn't measured in dollars or real estate appreciation. It was measured in the independence and security that allowed me to choose meaningful work over merely profitable employment, to help people who needed assistance, and to build the kind of life that reflected values rather than just ambitions. As I prepared for another day of investigating financial crimes and advocating for victims, I felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought me to this place and these relationships. Robert's attempt to steal my inheritance had ultimately led me to discover work that was more fulfilling than anything I had done before, and had strengthened my connection to family and community in ways that geographic distance had previously prevented. The morning sun was streaming through my office windows as I reviewed files for the day's client meetings, including a case involving a cryptocurrency investment scam that had targeted military veterans and their families. The work was challenging and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also meaningful in ways that made every difficult day worthwhile. My father had wanted to provide me with security and independence, and his careful planning had accomplished exactly that. But he had also given me something more valuable: the foundation to build a life of purpose and service that honored his memory while helping other people protect themselves and their families from predators who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. The fight for my inheritance had ended with complete victory, but the larger fight for justice and protection of vulnerable people would continue for as long as I was able to contribute to it. It was work worth doing, and I was grateful to have found my place in it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Robert had no answer that didn't further incriminate him, and his attorney seemed to have given up trying to salvage the situation. Pierce sat slumped in his chair, occasionally whispering to his client but making no further attempts to object. To Rachel's cross-examination, Judge Harrison had heard enough. After Robert returned to his seat, looking defeated and visibly shaken, the judge addressed both legal teams with barely concealed anger. "I have reviewed the evidence presented today, and I find Mr. Hayes's explanations to be not credible," Judge Harrison stated. "The forged power of attorney document, the false statements to the title company, the unauthorized disposal of proceeds, and the pattern of deceptive behavior described by Ms. Morgan constitute clear evidence of fraud and theft." The judge's words were like music to my ears, but he wasn't finished. Furthermore, Mr. Hayes's testimony today contained multiple statements that are contradicted by documentary evidence, suggesting that he has committed perjury in addition to his other crimes. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution, and I am ordering the immediate reversal of the property sale and restoration of all proceeds to Ms. Taylor. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Robert's carefully constructed world collapsed around him. My mother was sobbing quietly. Patricia Klein was smiling with grim satisfaction, and Marcus was squeezing my shoulder in congratulation. Robert himself seemed to be in shock, staring at the judge as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished delivering consequences for Robert's crimes, and what came next would ensure that he could never again prey on vulnerable women seeking comfort during their darkest hours. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom's stunned silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Additionally, I am issuing a restraining order preventing Mr. Hayes from contacting any of the victims mentioned in today's proceedings. And I am ordering a complete forensic audit of his business and personal finances to identify any additional fraudulent activities or stolen assets. The judge's gaze fixed on Robert with unmistakable contempt. Mr. Hayes, your actions represent a particularly despicable form of predatory behavior that this court will not tolerate. You have systematically targeted grieving women during their most vulnerable moments, exploiting their trust and affection to steal assets they worked decades to accumulate. The harm you have caused extends far beyond financial loss to include profound emotional trauma and the destruction of their faith in human decency. Robert seemed to shrink in his chair as the judge continued, his earlier composure completely shattered. The man who had projected such confidence and authority when manipulating my mother and his other victims now looked like what he truly was, a coward and a criminal who had finally been exposed. I am also ordering immediate restitution to all identified victims, Judge Harrison declared. Mr. Hayes's assets will be liquidated as necessary to restore the funds stolen from Margaret Chen, Patricia Williams, Dorothy Martinez, and Linda Taylor Hayes. Any remaining assets will be held in trust pending the resolution of criminal charges. The mention of my mother's name among Robert's victims was a stark reminder that she too had been defrauded, even though she had unknowingly participated in his scheme against me. The judge's recognition of her status as a victim rather than an accomplice would be crucial in protecting her from criminal liability, while ensuring she received compensation for the money Robert had stolen from her personal accounts. As court officers approached Robert to discuss the immediate implementation of the restraining order, I felt a complex mix of emotions washing over me. Relief that justice was being served, satisfaction that Robert's crimes had been exposed, but also profound sadness for the pain he had caused to so many people who had trusted him during their darkest hours. My mother remained seated in the gallery, her face buried in her hands as the full scope of her husband's deception became clear. She had married a man she thought would provide comfort and stability, only to discover that he had targeted her, specifically because of her vulnerability and her access to assets he could steal. The betrayal was absolute and devastating. Patricia Klein approached my mother with gentle compassion, offering tissues and quiet words of support. As my father's longtime friend and attorney, Patricia understood better than anyone how completely Robert had perverted the trust and affection that should have characterized a marriage between two people healing from loss. Rachel began gathering her files and evidence, her expression showing professional satisfaction at a job well done. The district attorney's office will be contacting you within 48 hours to discuss your testimony in the criminal case, she told me quietly. Robert is facing multiple felony charges including fraud, forgery, perjury, and elder abuse. Based on the evidence we've presented, I expect him to receive significant prison time. The criminal prosecution would be important, not just for punishing Robert's crimes, but for deterring other predators who might consider targeting vulnerable widows. Rachel had already been contacted by Adult Protective Services agencies in 3 other counties who suspected Robert might have victims they hadn't yet identified. His systematic approach to fraud suggested he had been operating for longer and more extensively than even our investigation had revealed. Jonathan Pierce was conferring urgently with his client, apparently explaining the severity of the situation Robert now faced. The civil judgment was just the beginning of his legal troubles. Criminal charges would follow within days, and the evidence presented in today's hearing had created an unshakable foundation for the prosecution's case. As we prepared to leave the courtroom, Robert suddenly stood and turned to face me, his expression a mixture of rage and desperation. "This isn't over, Jordan," he said, his voice carrying across the room despite the court officer's attempts to restrain him. "You think you've won something here, but you've destroyed your mother's life. She'll never forgive you for what you've done to this family." The threat was pathetic in its transparent attempt to manipulate me through guilt, but it also revealed Robert's fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Even after being exposed as a serial fraud artist and facing years in prison, he was still trying to blame his victims for the consequences of his choices. More personally, Tommy's willingness to testify against his own father despite the family consequences showed a level of moral courage that impressed me. He was choosing to do what was right, even though it would likely result in his father spending many years in prison and would devastate his own mother, who had been married to Robert before his predatory behavior began. "I want you to know that not everyone in the Hayes family is like him," Tommy said near the end of our conversation. "What he did to you and your mother was inexcusable, and I'm grateful that you had the strength to fight back and expose him." The conversation with Tommy helped me realize that Robert's crimes had harmed his own family as well as his victims. His son would have to live with the knowledge that his father was a serial predator. His ex-wife would have to explain to friends and neighbors why she had been married to a criminal, and other innocent relatives would suffer from association with his actions. Evil creates ripples of damage that extend far beyond its immediate targets, and Robert's selfishness had ultimately hurt everyone who had ever cared about him or trusted him with their well-being. As I contemplated the full scope of the damage Robert had caused and the long process of healing that lay ahead for all his victims, I began to understand what my decision about the future needed to be. My mother would need support as she rebuilt her life and learned to trust again. The other victims would benefit from having someone who understood their experience and could help them navigate the legal and emotional challenges they faced. Most importantly, I had discovered that fighting for justice wasn't just about recovering stolen money or punishing criminals. It was about standing up for values that mattered, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and ensuring that predators like Robert faced consequences that would deter others from following in their footsteps. The work wasn't finished, just because Robert had been arrested and the money recovered. The real work of healing and prevention was just beginning, and I realized I wanted to be part of that effort rather than returning to a comfortable but ultimately less meaningful career on the other side of the world. 3 months after Robert's conviction and sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, I stood in the kitchen of my father's house, watching steam rise from my morning coffee while early spring sunlight streamed through windows I had cleaned myself the weekend before. The house felt different now that it was truly mine again, not just legally but emotionally. Every room held memories of Dad, but they no longer brought the sharp pain of loss I had been running from when I fled to Singapore. Instead, they brought comfort and a sense of connection to the man who had shaped everything valuable about who I had become. The decision to leave my position in Singapore and return permanently to Portland hadn't been made impulsively. I had spent weeks weighing the financial implications, career opportunities, and personal fulfillment that each path would offer. My employer had been understanding about my extended absence, but had made it clear that my position required full commitment and physical presence in their offices. They offered me a generous severance package and glowing references, acknowledging that family emergencies sometimes required life-changing decisions. What ultimately convinced me to stay in Portland wasn't just my mother's need for support or my desire to oversee the restored property, though both factors were important. It was the realization that fighting Robert's fraud had awakened something in me that had been dormant during my years in international finance. The combination of investigative work, legal strategy, and advocacy for victims had engaged parts of my personality and skill set that corporate consulting had never touched. Rachel Morgan had been instrumental in helping me understand how my background in financial technology could be applied to combating fraud and protecting vulnerable populations. During the months we had worked together on Robert's case, she had observed my natural ability to analyze complex financial records, identify patterns of deception, and communicate effectively with both legal professionals and victims who were struggling to understand what had happened to them. "Have you ever considered specializing in financial fraud investigation?" Rachel had asked during one of our final meetings about Robert's criminal case. "There's a growing need for professionals who understand both the technical aspects of modern financial systems and the human psychology that makes people vulnerable to predators like Robert." The suggestion had planted a seed that grew stronger, as I witnessed the impact of Robert's crimes on his numerous victims. Margaret Chen, Patricia Williams, Dorothy Martinez, and the other women he had defrauded were all intelligent, accomplished people who had been targeted during moments of grief and vulnerability. They needed advocates who could help them navigate the complex intersection of legal proceedings, financial recovery, and emotional healing. I had spent considerable time during Robert's trial getting to know these women and learning about their experiences. Each had a unique story, but all shared common themes of manipulation, isolation, and systematic exploitation by someone they had trusted. Their courage in testifying against Robert despite their embarrassment and trauma had been inspiring, and their gratitude for my role in exposing his crimes had been deeply meaningful. "You gave us our voices back," Margaret Chen had told me, after Robert's sentencing. "When someone steals from you the way he did, you start to doubt your own judgment about everything. But seeing you fight back and win helped us remember that we deserved justice, not shame." The validation from Robert's victims had convinced me that using my skills to help others in similar situations would be more fulfilling than any corporate position could offer. I had begun studying for certification as a forensic financial analyst while simultaneously exploring options for starting my own practice specializing in fraud investigation and victim advocacy. The financial foundation provided by my inherited property made this career transition possible without the pressure of immediate income requirements. The rental income from both the main house, which I had decided to rent out rather than occupy myself, and the adjacent duplex provided steady cash flow that covered my living expenses and professional development costs. I had purchased a smaller townhouse closer to downtown Portland that served as both my residence and office space. My mother's recovery had been remarkable to witness, though it had required patience and professional support that I was grateful to be present to provide. The therapist Rachel had recommended, Dr. Sarah Williams, specialized in helping older adults who had been victims of financial and emotional abuse. Through weekly sessions, my mother had gradually learned to recognize the manipulation techniques Robert had used and to forgive herself for being deceived by someone she had loved and trusted. The hardest part wasn't losing the money, Linda had explained to me during one of our long conversations over dinner. It was realizing that everything I thought I knew about Robert was a lie he had created specifically to exploit my vulnerabilities. It made me question my judgment about everything and everyone. Dr. Williams had helped my mother understand that sophisticated predators like Robert study their victims carefully before beginning their manipulation campaigns. They identify specific emotional needs and vulnerabilities, then create personas designed to fulfill those needs while gaining access to assets or information they want to steal. The process is so gradual and subtle that even intelligent, experienced people often don't recognize what's happening until significant damage has been done. Your mother was targeted by a professional criminal who had perfected his techniques over many years, Dr.